shit. That's a good. Let me go clean up just a second, and then we'll get started. Just us three today?
Yep.
Alright, fantastic. So, play that. This.
Now recording.
Oh. Alright, I should be good on my end. We're talking about Central America, correct?
Central America, Narcostates, yeah.
No, this will be great. Actually, just got done with a great video on this. I'll have to reference.
Awesome. People are hearing us talk behind the scenes because they don't have my shit set up correctly for this, but I wanted to try and Discord again, so.
Alright.
That's not good. Don't worry, everybody, we'll be starting here shortly. I accidentally screwed up the official stream, and so there we go. All right. So everybody, hey, welcome again to another exciting episode of the Crowdsourced Politics presenting Cypher State. Cypher State is a foreign affairs and foreign policy focused podcast where we talk about a particular issue facing the geopolitical stage currently. Today, I am joined by lovely people. Let me get them on screen. By some lovely people here. We are joined today by Tiberius D.
Hello.
And North Countryman. Go ahead and please say something so the recording gets you.
Sure thing. Here's something. I just figured out how these headphones can work, so now I can actually hear you guys.
Awesome.
Like literally 1 second before you just asked me to say something.
Great. Love to see it. Well, why aren't you showing up? Hold on. So, for whatever reason, North Countryman, you're not showing up on my little thing. Let me see if I can fix this. Refreshing it help? Interesting.
If you need me to do something, say something.
No, it's not on your end. It's on mine. So I got like a speaker list on the side so people can tell who's talking, since nobody's got names above them. But it's not showing you for some reason. I don't know why that's the case. But, oh well, we'll just turn it off because there's only 3 of us, so it should be fine. So before we get started with today's episode, let me do 2 things. Let me mute my music. There we go. And how about North Countryman, introduce yourself a little bit for the guests, or for people that are doing tune in later, and Tiberius D, do the same after North Countryman.
Sure, I'm North Countryman. Relatively new content creator in the politics community. I have a master's in international relations, which is why Cypher lets me on these things. And you can largely find me in Twitch at twitch.tv/North Countryman, North with a 0. Also on Twitter. Looking into getting into more stuff, but that's down the road.
For sure.
It's a growing channel.
We are always happy to have you, North Countryman, so I'm glad you're able to join us today. Tiberius, how about you go ahead?
Yeah, so my name is Tiberius D. I studied in economics and political science. Unfortunately, I don't have any degrees, but on the other side of that is that I do know a lot of people that are in the industry that I like to listen to regarding the geopolitical studies that I kind of like to emulate, like to follow in. Now, I've gotten a bit of a name for myself in actually being a Twitch politics debater and being on different panels because I bring a very specific viewpoint, but it's actually not what I want to be known for. I actually want to be more known for produced content. But that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, and unfortunately, I'm just not quite there yet. So if you want to help me get there, definitely come check me out.
Hell yeah, and if you have a Patreon, please let us know. There we go.
Actually, I do.
Good. Go ahead, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and I'll drop it for my people as well.
Gotcha.
And I'm going to head and introduce myself. So, hey, everybody, if you're watching this, you should know who I am. But in case this is your first time, my name is Cypher. I am similar to Tiberius here. I studied criminal justice and political science while I was in college, and I am a data scientist by trade now. So I'm kind of going around this in a different way, but I have been doing podcasting for about 1.5 years now, and we decided to do Cypher State because not a lot of people on Twitch and some YouTube channels have really been focused on foreign relations. So I wanted to bring that to Twitch. I wanted to do a good podcast about that, so that's why we started this. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start the show with our little intro video, and then we'll get started.
Crowdsourced Tribune presents, in association with Crowdsourced Politics. This is Cypher State.
All right, and we are back. If you don't know who the voiceover is for that video, that is my lovely wife who graced me with her voiceover for the intro, and it's really good, so I had to produce it and put it up there. So let's go ahead and kind of get into the weeds about what we're talking about today and why we're talking about it. So to give you all just a little bit of background, I'm actually fairly interested in Latin American politics from a geopolitical lens, specifically because they're right in our backyard. And I felt that, outside of like super academic kind of podcast, like the Red Line for my friend over at the Red Line in Australia, and like, the New York Daily and stuff like that, not a lot of people have been covering it fairly well, I would say. I think a lot of people put their own personal politics in regards to like how they see American foreign relations with other countries, or what they wish that a domestic politics would look like, and they use that to like look at what is going on in Latin America. And so what I would like to do, what I hope this podcast does, what I hope this episode does, is that we kind of break it down a little bit more and get beyond the whole political ideological lens and actually talk about why these things are happening, who's at fault, and maybe what we can do about it. So I think it was North Countryman said that he's got a bit of the history. Tiberius, do you have a bit of the historical knowledge about this as well? Do you want to like which one of you would like to start first on that bit?
I can let North go, but I've got a plenty that I can definitely add as far as a history component to this.
I think maybe I'll do a brief overview, and
sure,
Tiberius can jump in with specifics. I think that'll probably work best.
That sounds great to me.
Yeah. So just for Latin America in general, obviously just without going into the weeds of the history, most of it, if we remember from our history, was colonized by Spain and Portugal. Then just gradually over time, they started gaining independence. However, unlike in the United States, where we had just kind of one revolution, then went to a democratic republic, a lot of Latin American countries would have maybe a popular uprising, but that would maybe be crushed. Then that would be followed by maybe a slightly more successful uprising, getting a few reforms. And quite often you'd have a military general would actually stage a coup, with the backing of those reformers within the public, excuse me. And unfortunately, a lot of those countries would then have military dictatorships for a long period of time. Mexico is a very good illustration of this. Even if it's not like officially a dictatorship, it's oftentimes they'll just rotate back and forth between the same few people. And as a result, with people in power who are not really focused on serving the people or getting reelected, they end up focusing on serving themselves. And if there's a drug trade, which oftentimes there is, drug trades are like weeds. They're, well, pun not intended. They just pop up a lot, and the money involved becomes very, very enticing to politicians or to dictators who are in power, and for bureaucrats who actually aren't paid that much or have a hard time putting food on the table for their family. They succumb to this, and you end up with a narcostate, which is that term because the money and influence of drug trafficking infiltrates the political institutions of a lot of these states and really undermines what we would consider their legitimacy.
Right. And with that, would you say that it's because of the instability primarily within the countries that's like in your estimation that's causing this, or is there like some sort of deeper issue with it that's causing the existence of the narco state?
I would say the institution creates the cracks that allows it to infiltrate.
Gotcha.
Because otherwise there's not really an alternative. Okay, well, where am I going to get the money to feed my family? Well, I'm not getting it from my job. I'm not getting it from, say, economic development. Oh, well, there's a drug trade that's making a lot of money.
Sure.
So they'll potentially go with that.
Now that was a very, very broad overview.
That's what I said I was going to give.
Yeah, no, I know. That's a very I'm not complaining. I'm saying like I want to get like. So Tiberius, when would you say that we should actually like start the look at this problem Would you like what time period are we
1500s.
talking about here? 1500s, all the way back
yes,
to the conquistadors.
all the way back. Yes,
right,
literally back to the conquistadors. Okay, so I've got two major assertions I'm going to put forward for this episode of why Central America or Latin America overall kind of sucks compared to what we see in North America. One of them is going to be geographic. I'll get to that later in the episode, but today I want to hit, or right now I want to hit, in particular, the historical part. And I want to give you the context here. 1500s, you've got Cortez and company coming through, right? And you've got the Aztecs, you got the Mayas, which are like literally on their way out, and you got the Incas here. But in North America, you've got like the Mississippian cultures, and they're far less populated. They're far sparse, and during this time, they're actually going to be hit by the Ameripox, as it's referred to, as basically all these diseases that are brought over by the conquistadors. They'll be largely wiped out by. Some data actually indicates that almost 90% of them are wiped out. When the conquistadors come into Central America, though, is that they have societies and institutions that they kind of find familiar. They're actually very feudalistic by their nature. And what does Cortez actually do to conquer the Aztec Empire? He does something that Europeans have done for about 400 years at this point, which is comes in, kills Montezuma, which is the emperor, basically usurps the entire establishment of what we now call Mexico into a new empire, which will eventually be the mainstream part of New Spain and the Spanish Empire. So one of my core contentions here, and one of my core issues is that the formational process of what Latin America goes through is significantly different than what we see in North America. North America is largely what we would call an outright colonial state, where people flood in from the old world and they build the institutions that they are accustomed to, and they continue off of that. In Latin America, it's very different. They continue off of this hybridized feudalistic system that is basically usurped from the Aztecs and from the Maya and from the Inca, and then is perpetuated in for years and years and years onward, versus if you look at the founding of Virginia Company all the way up into the 13 colonies, it's a lot more democratic from the start because it had to be. Down in Latin America, it was always a lot more feudalistic, aristocratic, and it never really escaped that to a large degree. So I'm going to say that all the way back during the conquistadors, we actually find one of the root problems. They don't have a system that is all that democratic. It's actually a lot more authoritarian.
Yeah, to kind of talk about. Go ahead, and I'll.
Yeah, I just had a point that when you brought up Cortez in Mexico, it reminded me that, and if I'm remembering this correctly, I think also Montezuma had a lot of enemies within the Aztec Empire, and Cortez would use those enemies to say, "Hey, go fight this guy for me."
It was that. Sorry.
Yeah, and that kind of thing, that pitting locals against locals for the purpose of the colonizing force, that is not unique to Latin America, and it creates a lot of deep-seated tensions really throughout much of the world.
It's a very common thing up until the 20th century, and even in the 20th century, it was very common. It's really weird because literally what Cortez does is something that is very akin to what the feudal lords would do in Europe. Example is William the Conqueror, right? Just basically comes in, kills Harold Hardrada, or I'm sorry, not Harold Hardrada. It's the other guy. Sorry, I can't remember his name off the top of my head.
Harold the Saxon, or Harold of Orange.
Yeah. Anyway, comes in and kills basically the King of England and takes the throne for himself, and just uses literally like bigger army diplomacy to win. And that is unironically kind of what Cortez and a lot of the conquistadors do, is they literally just come in and usurp with basically 400 years of knowledge of European politics, and they just use that in their own way to usurp Spain, or what is eventually New Spain. It's quite impressive what they are able to do. Granted, we can get into the smallpox and all these other things that come through that like absolutely destroy these societies, but it's almost like they're hard experienced into the point where they can literally just kind of roll in with gunpowder weapons and take everything over in 50 years?
Oh yeah, it was when they can. Yeah, it was timeline. It was very quickly, for sure. One of the things that, well, before we continue on, one of the things that I did want to mention here is that you said that the conquistadors, the Spaniards, were able, and Portuguese were able to essentially subjugate the populace much more quickly and actually successfully than the Europeans, UK and France did in North America. And I think that's very interesting because what I've read about this time period, one of my favorite books actually is called Why Nations Fail, and they talk about this a lot. And in that book, they basically say that in North America, they tried to reestablish the feudal system that existed in Europe for the benefit of the backers of the excursion. So, the governors appointed by the kings or what have you. And it didn't work because the winters were harsh. The native populations were actually more united against foreign incursions than what typically that seemed to happen within South and Central America and the like. And because of that difference, you saw the enslavement of South and Central America happen very quickly, whereas in North America it happened, but it was a long, arduous process to do it, and that was partly why they might have even imported slaves from Africa, because they weren't able to do it to the native population as the Spaniards were able to do in Central and South America. I just wanted a little bit of thoughts about that and see if I'm wrong, if you don't agree.
I do want to pick on this a bit. Number one, the slave trade really does actually start in South America, or not South America, but in Latin America. And this is largely due to the fact of the America pox, which is all these diseases that come through that wipe the population out, and they largely lose labor force. And so they decide to import one. And they decide to import people from Eurasia that are immune to these diseases. And unfortunately, these are people that are largely from Africa that are part of the what will be part of the triangle trade, or otherwise known as, we call it, the slave trade. So North America doesn't really actually pick that up immediately. They're actually going to get that later. What we do see in North America that I largely disagree with is that the reason why it's so much slower is, number one, is if you think about Central America in the actual history, is that it's actually a lot more populated, and it's a lot more akin to what Europe does look like in some regards, where you've got all of these feudal states, or what we would call feudal states, kind of vying for power. It's largely systems that are what we would call states and institutions. In North America, that's not quite the case. Population density is significantly lower, and if they're not openly nomadic, they're, if you will, regressive to the point of tribal. You have the Iroquois Confederacy. These other folks, while technically more united overall, are far less of an ever-present force. And one of the things that we see in the early colonial days, particularly as Lord Baltimore tried to put down, was, all right, cool, I'm part of the Virginia Company or a part of the Maryland Company. We own you, or you're in indentured servitude. But what we would continuously find is that people who would come over would literally just pack up and leave whatever settlement they were supposed to be out, and they would go into the hinterlands, because you've got 10 million acres in these general coastal areas that you just get dropped off into, that you can go out and about and build your own society. You don't need the people who just paid your bills over. And a lot of people kept leaving. And this is actually how we see very democratic and Republican processes start taking off literally from the start. That instead of having the open viceroys, which are something that we'll see more in India and throughout the rest of the British Empire, we'll see colonial congresses. That'll be the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is literally how it forms. The Commonwealth of Maryland. This is how it forms. Is that the state that is the Empire of England, or if you will, the Kingdom of England, will have to literally just give suzerainty or sovereignty to these colonialists in order just to keep them on the same page. That's largely what happens.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that's very fair. I think that's very fair. Like I said, that's like one of my favorite books. So I just wanted to point it out. But go ahead, North Countryman.
Yeah, one side thing. This is somewhat unique with the Mexico versus the U.S. and Canada stuff. Is they had kind of continual relations with their home country. You mentioned the Virginia Company and whatnot. And obviously Canada stayed close to the UK for a lot longer. Mexico, however, with Spain, Cortez went there and he was technically told, hey, come back. But he said, nope, I'm not doing that. So there's a bit more of a kind of fly by the seat of their pants, but in the worst way possible.
No, very important point. Oops. There we go. So Tiberius, you were saying that we had to go all the way back to the conquistadors in order to understand this, and I think that's a good important point. But where, like, if you were to fast forward to a particular time period, when would it be the next step that we have to like pay extra attention to?
I would say there's two major steps along the way that you could have changed the course of history for Latin America, and that is independence, and then the next one is the revolutionary periods that they'll have. Mm-hmm. Independence is pretty straightforward. This is when Spain, or when basically the local nobility says that Spain is not worth being a part of it. And that friction was slow rolling. I mean, they consider it literally like the revolutions of our day, but they're not really revolutions. They're literally breakaway sentiments, similar to what we kind of see in the United States, but far worse. The original Mexican Revolution that actually breaks them away from Spain kills 500,000 people. Like, it's kind of ridiculous in the level of how fierce it was. And literally Spain largely goes into this war, or this secessionist movement, if you will, under the guise that if they can't have it, they'll burn everything to the ground. And that literally is what the last 4 years of this particular engagement is that Spain realizes that they're losing, and they'll literally just torch half of Mexico. Overall, what happens here is a little sad, but a little weird, and I'm going to be a little bit nihilistic here, but it's kind of one of those creative destruction measures. The problem with what we see during the secessionist movement, or you will, the independence movements, is that it brings their society almost to its knees, if we're talking about the settler state. But it doesn't outright break them to the point where they need a societal reformation. And so eventually, the kleptocrats that have been running it as a more feudal system will be able to retain power, keep power, and this is what we'll start to see with the military juntas of Mexico. Even though it's technically a republic, it really acts as more of a military junta. And that's a problem. And that will continue for the better part of another 100 years before you get the Mexican Revolution, or at least the more modern one, which, brings out Cinco de Mayo and whatnot. All of this gets terrible. It's terrible.
No, and it's important to point that out, because what I would say that we kind of see is a for lack of a better way to phrase this, is kind of like the establishment of some sort of hierarchical system within Central and South America that is partly around racial lines, but also partly around class lines. Would you say that that's correct? Okay. And then what we see during the revolutionary period is that we're seeing kind of like somewhat of a breakdown of that without the entire removal of it. And I think that's part of the things that we see reverberating today, which is the indigenous movements within Central America, South America, are still, for a very large part, still fighting for full recognition, sometimes autonomy. It depends on the state, right, or the country. And that is partly how we see things like, within Brazil. We're not talking about Brazil today, but it's a good example. Like within Brazil, how the native populations get, see their territory get taken, or the Amazon forest get curbed and things like that, against what exists against their wishes. Would you say that that's fair?
I'd say more than not. Like, this gets into classism, and granted, I'm not a huge follower of our good friend Marx, but overall, there is a level where like class warfare is absolutely a real thing, and this is definitely something that it predominates Latin America. We talk about the 1% here in the United States, but it's nothing compared to what we see in Latin America. Usually in Latin America, it's the 0.01 that is in control of so much, and it is. Like, literally, Mexico has two different terms for poverty, where, for them, impoverished is you can't buy normal goods, but then you have, like, an upper poor class for them that is, like, I can't remember what it's called, like, lower, it would translate to, like, a lower poverty or a greater poverty, where you can afford some things, just not all the things. And that just actually emphasizes what I'm actually getting at, which is we're talking about places that, I don't like to talk about wealth distribution a whole lot because that's not really my gig. But there's a point where you have to acknowledge that it's a thing. And if people are scared of what's going on in North America and Europe, take a look at Latin America. It's been so much worse for so much longer. And they never really broke those old systems. They never had the Industrial Revolution that kind of made a middle class for Western Europe and North America. They had an Industrial Revolution, but everyone who got all the nice things from that were the aristocrats.
Right. And, North Countryman, what would you say about my question or some of the points that we've been making?
What Tiberius mentioned, it reminded me of something, not Latin America, this was Eastern Europe, but it had to do with judges and how judges there, it was commonplace for them to accept bribes. And I remember one of my undergrad professors told me this, and he was told this at a conference, and then he asked, well, why do they accept bribes? And he was told, because they need to feed their families. And in the US, our judges are paid quite a lot. And that's actually unusual in a lot of other countries. And as a result, okay, well, guess what? We actually have to be able to buy necessities. So that leads to bribery. And drug trade is pretty good at bribery.
Very true.
So
can I piggyback off that for just a second?
Yeah, go for it.
One of the things that you can definitely look at in South America is the official salaries of a lot of these institutions are incredibly low. We're talking not only police officers, but judges, administrators, all the way up to governorships. They're incredibly weak as far as actual payment compensation. In the United States, we like to complain about how much people are paid or not paid. I'm actually of the opinion that we need to pay our representatives more, but other conversation entirely. But I mean, some people think that they're overpaid here, and I look at Mexico and I'm like, everyone's on the take. It's most of the people don't accrue their wealth through actual salary and position. They secure it through bribery, extortion, and basically everything that we would call dirty and dark money.
Yeah.
This is real corruption. It's using the position to influence people in a particular way where it's not by law, and it's not like, hey, I'll give you $1 billion to have this interstate if you give me $1 billion to have this high-speed rail. It's, hey, pay me up now, or I have the mob show up on you, or basically the gangster will show up on your doorstep. It's incredibly.
It's a line from Goodfellas that I don't think we could say if you want to put this out in podcast format.
Yeah.
Yes. Unironically, that's kind of where it is, and I hate that that's what we're dealing with here. But the problem is that if you don't have enough people as a middle class or a lower class that can check the richer, more prominent people, this is what happens when extreme wealth does get out of hand. You're going to turn me into a Marxist on this episode, but hey, whatever.
I mean, if Marx wouldn't be so popular if it wasn't for the fact that he's hitting on some truths, right? So just because you don't necessarily agree with his ultimate conclusions doesn't mean you have to discount everything that he said. Yeah, exactly.
And this is actually why I firmly point forward that the reason that we see so many what we would call left-leaning or leftist movements within Latin America is for exactly this reason. You don't see the hard right do extremely well in Latin America. We can talk about Bolsonaro in Brazil, but that's actually more of the exception rather than the rule. They tend to be, if they are right-wingers, military juntas and dictatorships, but the people don't generally like them. The more popular movements are far more leftist and left-wing. And, they might be more successful, but then you have to point the direction at the American, foreign policy, which is a whole other conversation.
It's a whole other conversation, but I'm glad that you brought it up because I think that this is another key aspect of why we're seeing what we're seeing in Latin America, right? So, I think the people that watch this show or anything else that either any of us on the show produce are going to be fairly knowledgeable, so we don't have to get too much into the weeds on it. But, they call them banana republics for a reason, right? And the Chiquita actually like controlled all of, oh god, but I'm terrible with names. Well, which was the country? What was like which country did Chiquita actually control?
I gotta remember myself. I don't even remember.
You know what? I'm gonna look it up right now.
I want to say Panama, but I could be wrong. I don't.
Chiquita controlled which country? Panama. You're right. Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador, Colombia, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Peru. That's where they were all located in. And it was Panama. They basically controlled all of Panama. So, like, it's a thing, right? And then America's incursions into Latin America can go all the way back, even before the Monroe Doctrine, but you can at least go to the Monroe Doctrine where we said, hey, this is our sphere of influence. Everybody else, fuck off. And you see, America.
Oh, we can say that word.
Oh, yeah, you can say fuck off. Don't worry about it.
Oh, by the way, just to interrupt you and hijack your show a little bit. Chiquita Brands, owned by, I think it was John Foster Dulles. His brother, Alan Dulles, founded the CIA. So there is a link between those two. 100% true. 100% true.
This is going to be a memes episode. I love it.
Oh my God. Like I was saying, like, this is stuff that actually has happened, and it gives leftists in the United States ammunition against our own government. The three of us are all Americans here. And like, you have to acknowledge that these are problems. A lot of business interest within the United States, when we were interfering in Latin America more directly, were actually like in charge of military units, or, at least being like, hey, come over and like establish this rubber factory for us. And America's like, okay, we need it for war anyway, so fuck it. Right. And that's just like a thing. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. And I want to get both of your opinions, because I'm more left than either of you. So I want to understand where you guys come from. North Countryman, how about
you're
you?
a rose. You're a rose between two thorns here.
I am. Go for it. So,
what was the?
So I just want to like get more of your opinion on like how much American foreign policy might have like impacted what we're seeing kind of today. How much of the blame in your estimation rest on American interference within Latin America for corruption and the eventual existence of a narco-state, but going before, I think the war on drugs.
Yeah, I think a lot of what, part of the reason why the U.S. had such an involvement in Latin America, especially with the replacing of elected leaders with military juntas, is the backdrop of the Cold War. Castro came into Cuba with like 12 guys and overturned Fulgencio Batista and set up a communist government like 90 miles off of Florida. And that scared the U.S. quite a lot. And so that plus domino theory, which is the idea that if one nation falls to communism, other nations are going to fall too, meant, all right, we're seeing these, very kind of, yay, workers, the U.S. imperialism sucks, and cozying up to the Soviets, the U.S. looks at that and says, okay, we don't want that to happen. So you end up with several coups they're removing elected leaders from power, and then a junta comes into place. And it happens so much that like if you ask someone, find examples of the U.S. committing regime change, but then you said, aside from Latin America, I think there's like maybe two that I can think of, maybe off the top of my head, if that. Tiberius can probably think of a few more, but yeah, most of that regime change happened in Latin America because we did it a lot.
Well, just to get a little more opinion of like,
as part of the Cold War.
Right, but that was part of the Cold War, but wasn't some of that in relation to how we propped up people or business interests that happened before then? Do you know anything about that or have an opinion on it? Like, because with Baptista, America tried to establish not tried to establish, but very heavily influenced Cuba to be basically a vacation spot. And so a lot of the prime real estate areas was developed for American hotels and business people in order to vacation down there, while the southern area of the country basically was left to squalor.
I mean, if you look at it as like Latin America, the U.S. somewhat does look at it as America's backyard, which is probably a very patronizing way of looking at it. And because if you look at, say, like the Monroe Doctrine, it says, no, Europe, you do not come interferes with these quote unquote independent states. But then eventually you have the Roosevelt corollary and saying like, oh, you know what? We actually will. Even the history of the Panama Canal, just the selection of Panama as the location of that. It was originally, I think, going to be in Colombia, but some other people wanted it in Panama, and they said, oh, you know what? Colombia has a big volcano that'll possibly erupt. And it didn't. And so they just said, no, we're going to do it in Panama instead. So there is just honestly sometimes petty financial related motivations for U.S. interfering in Latin America. And so it's that idea of like, this is in our backyard. We can do what we want. It's
America's turn to empire now, baby.
Honestly, yeah, that's kind of it. It's like, it's a little bit kind of when parents spank their children, it's like, it's my kid, I can do what I want, but with nations involving their children, involving other nations.
Right.
Like, well, except in this case, no, they're not our kids.
Gotcha. Tiberius, thoughts, opinions?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna go all in on this one, but I'll suffice it to say that if I had to break it down, I'd say there was about 40% of this that is like the historical institutionalism that we've been talking about. I'm gonna say there's another 30 or 40% of this that falls into the geography, and the remaining, which would be about 20-30, is probably the American influence. Now, here's the thing where I'm going to distance myself from some parts that have been said here. Just because you have a multi-directional input for certain things does not mean that you have a conspiracy. I think you all are familiar with like that kind of phrasing. The problem that you tend to have is actually most of the American influence within Latin America isn't directly like foreign ops or the American government trying to topple them nearly as much as it is American businessmen coming in and toppling government. And we saw this in Hawaii as an example, is that literally you have corporate leaders and business leaders and wealthy people can literally come in and just take out entire governments on their own behalf. They don't even have to have government or U.S. Government support. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And I also want to point out that we do punch both ways. As much as we are like, oh, evil leftist people, we have to kick their ass, which is definitely a remnant of the Cold War. Is that we also hit military juntas and right-wing people that we didn't particularly like either, particularly Manuel Noriega in Panama back in '89. We openly would take sides, and we would openly just be like, all right, we don't like you. You don't tell the line very well, and we would just tell you get stuck in. Panama obviously is one of those weird situations because it doesn't matter if it's right-wing or left-wing. If they're not wanting to fill the role that we left for Panama because it's got the canal, we largely step in at a moment's notice. So it's not going to be the same as Nicaragua, as an example, which can get away with a lot more because we don't necessarily care as much. And it's quite interesting to see some of these states and how and where they've actually all lined up.
Okay, that's fair. For me personally, I think that you can't, like, I think as somebody that's really far left would be like, it's all America's fault. CIA ops, everything is America's fault. I don't think you can do that. You have to have. You
say that, I'm pretty sure like each of us saw like 6 different people that we've interacted with who would say that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Like, there's people that say this stuff, and I wouldn't go that far. I would say that it makes entirely sense. Like, if you look at the world from a kind of realpolitik lens, which I think is actually one of the better lenses to look at how interactions happen, because you can kind of game theory it out a bit, is that people have interest and they have their own individual sections of power. And so if their interests are being thwarted, they will use that power in order to reassert their interest. And So we have that with America, the government, America businesses, and etc. But you also have that within the countries themselves, where there are different pockets of power, different pockets of corruption, or what have you. And they're also trying to leverage either where America is going or where anti-American people are going in order to assert their own power. And so I think it's not like a 50-50 split. I would say like foreign relations, the bigger dogs in the fight have probably more sway within the smaller countries than a 50-50 split, maybe like 60-40, 70-25, maybe, it depends on the area. But you can't take all the agency away from the country and the people they're in and say that they don't have any culpability in the matter. So that's where I come on this. That's where I fall on this, is there. But I think we've talked broadly about Latin America, about where things have started. I think now we can get into more of the nitty gritty surrounding the drug war in particularly, and the rise of what has been called the Narcostate. So this would start around the drug war, specifically both videos, and combine them for YouTube. Hey everybody, sorry about that. My OBS crashed on me. So as I was saying, I don't think you can do 50-50. And what we're getting at, I don't know exactly when it crashed. I just saw that my program crashed, so I don't know exactly where I left off at. But I want to get started talking about the war on drugs, how and what led to the Narcostate. And I think personally that you can go back before the war on drugs with Nixon and start to look at when the war on drugs really started, which was with marijuana. Would either of you say that that's a fair assessment, that we could actually start there a little bit because of the importation and growing of marijuana, or do you think this actually has to start with Nixon during the Cold War, and look at it that way?
I think for the U.S. focus, that's there. I think we might want to go a little earlier than Nixon, but just the idea of narco states in general.
Sorry.
At one point, and just doing the research on this, UK at one point could have been considered a narco state just because of the opium wars.
Oh, for sure.
So it's not the term narco state. It's got a long history in the use of drug trade and infiltrating governments and kind of being used for nefarious purposes. It's got a long history, and not just unique to Western Hemisphere.
Sure. That's a very good point. But as we are talking mostly around, Latin America and things like that, would you say that
was just a fun asterisk?
Yeah, gotcha. So you would say just maybe slightly before Nixon, but not too earlier than that for this particular topic?
Yeah, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that, just because you'd have to establish that, okay, there is a trade actually coming in.
Gotcha.
At some point.
Tiberius, what about you? Where would you say this might have actually started?
So I'm actually going to feign a little bit of ignorance here. I'm not 100% sure where I want to start it. I know some history regarding the drug trade. I know some history regarding Central American influence or American influence in Central America. But I'm not actually going to openly be like, oh, yeah, it's totally this. I'd actually have to study up on that, and I apologize, but I don't know.
No, I mean, that's entirely fair. I don't know I am not confident enough to say, yes, 100% started here. That's why I was like, I think it would start around this time frame. And I think that's important, because I think that is something that not just us as, nascent political talking heads say, but I think this is also something that isn't actually agreed upon, at least in my research, by higher up academics and the like. And so I think that's an important distinction to do here. One of the other things that I think is important, and this might be backtracking a little bit, but you can't really have the existence of a narco state without two things, which is the trade, as Tiberius said, and the corruption that we've been previously talking about. Would either of you say that that's fair as well? That it actually takes these two things to create it? Or do you think that the existence of a drug trade and having it being illegal in and of itself creates the corruption that that cascades and goes down the line.
I think there's three things here. Can I take this real quick? Yeah.
Sure.
So I think there's three things here. Number one is that part of it is the supply and demand. If you need demand for drugs, actually supply to drug, right? So, and Americans love their cocaine and their heroin and all that stuff, which is unfortunate, but is reality. And they have the money to spend it, or they have the money to get it, which is even more. Second is that, unironically enough, drug organizations kind of act like terror networks in a way. And I'm not saying like they're one and the same, but they have similar mechanics in the regards that if you have a state that is extremely strong, that can police its sovereign territory very hard and very strongly, it's really hard to get a terror network or a drug organization really going and really thriving. But if you have one that's just weak enough to claim sovereignty over an area, but not entirely strong enough to enforce it, and we can talk about Central America, and I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about Afghanistan in particular, is that's kind of the same mechanic overall, where you've got Panama, you've got Honduras, you've got Nicaragua, which are, they are states and they do have some level of central control, but they're actually not strong enough to literally police their entire regions with active police forces and active military presence. They can't control their borders superfluously. They don't have enough of a navy or a coast guard to patrol their shorelines. And so you're going to have people be able to slip through the cracks. And then third and foremost is, I think, part of that institutional part that I've been hitting over and over again, which is if you've got cracks and you've got people that can influence into the cracks where you can start paying off 3 people instead of 30 people because you have far less of a separation of power, then it's easy for everyone to get in on the cut. Or for the few people that need to be on the cut, it's easier for them to do so. And this is actually one of the things that I really think democracy is great at. Having the separation of power between individuals, as much as it possibly can be, is a great way to keep people policed and in line, because everyone can call each other out on their nonsense. But when it's more kleptocratic or aristocratic, you don't have as many people to call it out. So
yeah, I think
I
think that's a very good point about the separation of powers, because like you said, if there's only 3 people you have to pay off, that's much easier to do than like the 30, and democracy helps with that. But North Countryman, what were you wanting to say?
Just as a counterpoint, is if you look at, say, Prohibition in the U.S. in the 1920s, well, you had someone like Al Capone. He wasn't taken out by a coup or anything like that. He was imprisoned for tax evasion,
right?
Which is kind of a really good example of institutions staying in place. He wasn't got by the FBI or anything like that. He was got by the IRS.
No, that's actually.
Or if you believe Hollywood, Kevin Costner and Sean Connery.
Yeah,
still a pretty good movie. You can have infiltration in, like, say, maybe local levels in Chicago, but when you have those kind of stronger institutions, even at the national level, they can fight back, and sometimes they'll win.
Yeah, and
so the institution thing is pretty important.
No, that's very true. There was so much like murder that happened during this time period in the United States that we had to centralize power a little bit more. The creation of the ATF and the implementation of different like laws under the Commerce Clause in order to fight the organizations, and giving an FBI a little more authority. And I think that's something that's been missing. Not been missing, but it's been like more nascent, at least within Latin America, I would say. Because of, as Tiberius said, and North Countryman, you said that they don't have as strong central authorities to actually go into maybe the rural areas where they're hiding out at, or maybe they don't pay enough, they don't have enough wealth to actually pay people to combat the narco terrorist networks, and so they're able to pay off people and build up political capital, much like the mob did in like little Italy's across the United States and that sort of thing, because there just wasn't the economic activity. Would you say? You're going like this? Are you see the
no? I largely agree with that. I didn't want to voice up for any particular over details.
Sure.
But this is where we've seen this literally since time immemorial, is that organized crime can absolutely infect the political structure.
Mhm.
And usually what we see that allows that is either one of two things. One is that just people don't have enough money and they have to use the crime to get by. And this is literally what we see here in modern America in our poorest neighborhoods. People don't turn to crime because they want to. People turn to crime because they can't pay the bills. Like, and it's just literally what it is. How many stories have you heard about a father who turned to selling drugs just to feed his kids? Like, that's a real thing.
A ton.
Yeah, it's a real thing. On the other side of that is that the reason organized crime can really permeate into a community is when it corrupts its leaders, and we were just talking about that. So yeah. I was largely shaking my head to agree with you more than anything. So
okay. Yeah, that's fair. So we've been streaming for about 50 minutes or so. What is there anything that we haven't talked about that you really want to get into before we start talking about like possible solutions to this? Because we've given this huge broad overview with like history and talking about corruption and everything, but we haven't like gotten into in particulars. And I'm not saying that we have to, but I do want to give you both the opportunity to say more on something before we move into like possible solutions.
I still want to hit Go ahead.
Just a quick thing to put numbers on the money aspect.
Sure.
The salary of a president of Mexico converted into U.S. currency is like $4,000 a month, whereas the American president's like 9,000 plus. So it's like half there, and that's the current salaries. So,
wow. That does put it in perspective.
Yeah. Yearly, it's like 116,000 for the U.S. president, but Mexican president's only like 57,000, which is an average American salary, close to.
Yeah, it's close to median. Wow.
Yeah, the United States president makes 400,000 as a government salary a year, and each a sitting freshman representative will make 176,000.
Yeah, middle class in New York.
I'm not going to get there, but anyway, I do have one thing I want to tag on, and that was the geography section. And being the person that looks into geopolitics, there are certain areas of the world that I think are far more like suitable for human habitation and development than others. What we tend to find overall, and I've got a long video series that I'm working on explaining this, is that there are places where it does seem that human industry, human societies like to thrive far better at. And it used to start with like river valleys. You'd have the Tigers, Euphrates, the Indus River Valley, that kind of thing. And then it expanded out into like the river plains themselves. So you got Mesopotamia. Then eventually you would have largely what we saw within China, as an example, is that you got the major river valleys there. That would be the core of what we now call modern China. The last level of technological diffusion made it to where it is now temperate climate zones that are interlaced with river valleys that you can float stuff. And so we're talking, if you just notice the map here, look at North America, look at most of Europe, and then look at parts of Asia overall, where you see relatively flat rivers that are in areas that have a little bit of a winter and a little bit of a summer, seems to be some of the most probable and stable institutions that you find in the modern world. But if you look at Mexico, if you look at most of Latin America, there's only one place in all of what we consider Latin America where you have any of that. And that's the La Plata, aka Argentina. Well, Argentina is an interesting case if we need to get into that. But overall, is that if you actually look at Mexico in particular, it's got two problems. One, it's either tropical or arid. And two, it's incredibly mountainous. And to summarize this all really quickly, if you're going to build a road from place to place, you don't want mountains in the way. That's always expensive as hell. You can go through Colorado, Utah, Nevada to find that out very, very quickly. And then what makes it even worse is that if you're in places that don't have what we would call temperate climate zones, is that it's hard to grow crops, it's hard to regulate water, it's hard to regulate your climatology. Go to southern Georgia and find out how bad your AC bill is most of the year. these
I
things
live in Texas, so
yes, these things add up to generating capital and wealth in the regards that every time that you have to pay a higher power bill because you're in an arid place or a tropical place because you're running the air conditioner, that's less money that you have to spend on other projects. And what we largely seem to have in the United States and Europe in particular, which is, the chokehold of industrialized civilization, is that it generates more capital because it's got mild winters and mild summers compared to most of the world. And I think that's a huge deal. I really do.
Here's a fun asterisk to underline the AC thing. In the statuary hall in the House of Representatives, each state can submit two prominent individuals, who are deceased from their states to have a statue in there. Florida submitted the guy who invented the air conditioning.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's a great little piece of trivia. Yeah, there is a reason why, in the southern hemisphere and like in places where there's a ton of humidity, that siestas exist, right? That people take large chunks of time off in the middle of the day. It just gets too fucking hot to do anything before AC existed. So you just like Connor did this. He was like, he said this. He's like, you're just sitting there stewing in your own juices, drinking lemonade or like water or whatever, because you couldn't do fuck else. So I think that's a great point that you brought up, Tiberius. Before we get into any other other fixes, is there anything else that you want to bring up?
I largely hit everything I wanted to.
Okay.
A lot of people do not respect the geography and climate. They don't really think about what that actually can do. And so I'm always going to beat that drum whenever I can. And it's not just because I'm on a crusade, but it's my job. Or at least what I want my job to be is talking about how demography and geography play a lot more of a role than a lot of people think that it actually does. And quick tagline here: demography in the United States is going to be a huge issue regarding labor. So hire me on for that chat.
Oh no, we definitely all need to get together for that one. That's God, I wish I could get a hold of Logan again. He's basically a demographer turned real estate investor. So he knows his shit on that one too.
I hit on supply chains, Tiberius, so don't worry about hitting on your favorite topics. We all have our passions.
Oh, yes. I know.
So I do want to to wrap up the show. I do want to talk about some of the possible fixes, and in those fixes, I want to say talk about how much all of us believe that the United States government should play a role in this, if at all. So I'll start first, and then I'll just give a possible fix with this, or maybe a long-term thing, and then we can go kind of round table. North Countryman, you can give your thing, and then Tiberius can give his thing, and then we can just kind of ping back and forth off of this. So I think one of the central issues that we all know it's corruption, right? That's the central issue. But in order to tackle corruption, you have to have certain things, and one of those things is you have to have investment. And I think that's where America could come in to do it, but it has to be done through a program that doesn't look like we're just trying to take things for ourselves. And there's going to be worried people are going to be understandably wary of any U.S. or international investment into a Latin American country because of the history that's back there. So I think that's one of the things that we can do, but it has to be done very narrow focused, and also with the direct input of the people that not just are in power, but the people that live in the area where there's going to be investment. So I think that's one of the things that we can do. North Countryman, what about you?
Yeah, I would agree that they definitely do need to do that kind of infrastructure and investment, which somewhat reminds me, both good and bad news, is that one of the sources of investment in other countries that isn't U.S. or has the quote unquote taint of imperialism that would come from opponents is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which they're doing pretty heavily, I believe, in Africa. I don't know how prominent they are in Latin America. I haven't heard much, but it is something where they are investing in, they're putting in they're putting in roads, and they're building in those supply chains to keep things to serve as just kind of an alternative to the U.S. And, well, having an alternative to the U.S. is okay, but not when it's an oppressive authoritarian regime like China. So that's kind of there's an opportunity there, but it's not a good one.
That's fair. What would you say other than like investment in infrastructure is something that can happen in Latin America to help with the with the issue we've been talking about, though?
Probably, I would say having a bureaucratic system that is kind of more of merit based, like a very strong civil service system, like an actual like serious one where like, gotcha. No, you are in by your qualifications, not based on who you know, and they're actually paid a worthy amount. And this might, you need legitimate politicians, kind of like who's the guy in Venezuela, Juan Guaido. You need guys like kind of in that mold, but elected into high office prominently. Like, they have the understanding of how to do this, but you're not coming from, like, say, Jair Bolsonaro, who's a former military guy, and all they know is military. You need people with the understanding of this is how you build up a community.
So some sort of like technocrat, but like of
yes,
people.
That's the word I'm looking for.
Okay, that's fair. Tiberius, what about you?
Use one word to describe my ramble.
So I'm gonna have to go a lot darker here, and I actually had this conversation just the other day. I hate this, I really do. So I don't think investment is really the primary problem anymore. It's gotten a lot better with particularly NAFTA, which is now the USMCA. Is that I can't pronounce any of these states, but as an example, bordering Texas, there are 3 major Mexican states. One of them is Nuevo Leon. I can't pronounce the other 2. But between Texas and these 3 states, as part of the NAFTA agreement, we have largely built out $1 trillion industry, $1 trillion in heavy industry. These are automobiles. These are largely assembly line productions of some form or another that all the lower end stuff is done on the Mexican side, and then the final assembly is largely done on the Texas side. And we're talking everything around Laredo, Corpus Christi, Brownsville, that kind of thing, right? Overall, just in this region, is that the I-35 and the I-37 corridors basically are the final end product or final end of that stage. But on the Mexican side is you've had $1 trillion of investment overall in this, and we're not seeing a lot of increases of livelihood and prosperity that we would usually expect out of that level of investment. Don't get me wrong, all the industry's there, all the jobs are there, but when we're actually talking about the level of pay that these folks get, when we're talking about the actual level of care that they get, they have better health care. That's about it. Like, overall, we're looking at a system that just doesn't really get the bottom line people to where they should be, especially even considering that they're bordered next to the superpower. There's a wonderful documentary I've been watching recently about Nogales, which is a city that borders in Arizona, Mexico and Arizona, right? It was literally split by the gas and purchase. And one of the weird parts is that you literally look by a border, one side has an income that is double that of the other. One side has twice the amount of college graduates, all of this stuff, right? What we're seeing, at least for me, is that with CAFTA and with NAFTA overall, is that the investment opportunities are there. And for what is happening is we've seen a massive amount of build out within Mexico that makes it not look like a third world nation anymore. We've got numerous pipelines that have been built in the last 10 years that is alleviating the brownout problems because they're tying themselves into the natural gas outflows of the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas, and they're powering their power plants with it. So, like, literally the power revolution that we're having here in the United States, they're having in Mexico too. But all of this just isn't hitting this massive input. And the reason why I went down this whole level of train is that I think that Latin America kind of has to go through another like breakdown revolutionary period to get to where they need to be. And that is either they're going to have to politically defang a lot of these aristocrats, or they're going to have to quote unquote kill them. And
say the last part again.
They're going to have to probably kill them. Like, I mean, I'm not openly advocating for this, but this is what we generally see when you have this level of power stuck in, is that you see a full revolution. And I'm not openly condoning this or saying this, but this is just, what we generally deal with, is that either the aristocrats have to give up power and they're forced to, which that's rough, or generally at some point the people get pissed off enough they take it. And again, not advocating for anything here, but honestly, I'm just kind of waiting, and I'm sitting and waiting because I don't expect things to get much better for Mexico. And that's the tragedy. You've got numerous jobs, numerous amounts of industrialization and capital pouring into the country, and it just goes to the top 1%. And I know I'm sounding like a crazed Marxist here, but there's a level where if you don't have the institutions to actually prop up the people who make your society function, then you don't have a society that helps the average person. And this is something that if you guys are actually concerned about this, I've actually talked about this for the United States and Western Europe as well. We're not getting better, we're getting worse. And we're starting to look more and more like that system every day. I have reasons to believe why that is, but that's a whole other episode too.
Sure. I think that's fair, and this is something that is worse in other parts of Central America as well. So that Mexico, we know Mexico like the back of our hand, right? Because we live next to Mexico, but the other Latin American countries have endemic corruption. They have endemic wealth inequality, and it's at levels worse than what we're seeing in Mexico. A lot of people leave from Central America to get to the United States. They have to pass through Mexico, and sometimes they stay in Mexico, but oftentimes they're like, no, we gotta get away from all this stuff, all the drugs, all the gangs, because they have people everywhere. And so that's a very important point. I think another thing that could be done, and you know what, I was gonna say it, but never mind, now I'm thinking about it, because it's being done, it's just not being done well, and that is joint exercises between the US and Mexican police, Guatemalan military, what have you, in order to root out the cartels themselves. And that's something that's been happening for decades, basically since the DEA has existed, right? You can track this all the way back to the DEA's founding, essentially. And it doesn't seem to work because once you, it's like a hydra, right? Once you cut off one head, two heads grow. And you just gotta kill the entire body, and you can't do that absent maybe not a full scale invasion by the United States, but something similar within a country, right? So I don't know how they could tackle this issue absent that kind of thing. Do either of you think there's a possibility for them to do it that way? Or is this beyond military and police actions, and this is something that's going to have to come maybe from the bottom up, like that article that a friend shared in our group chat?
I've got two things here. The Americans can help, but the Americans are going to have to do this in a very heavy-handed way that's going to make a lot of Americans uncomfortable. But it can be done, and that is, I don't want to say openly invasion, but you're talking about states that literally can't police their own sovereignty. Or at least if they can, it's just enough where they can keep their own national borders intact, but they can't stop drug traffickers. They can't stop human trafficking. They can't stop, they literally can't stop the convoys and caravans to a large degree. And some degree, they don't even want to. That's a problem. Not only for them, for us. We talk about immigration all the long day, but you got to remember that on the other side of that, this is a massive amount of human capital and human labor that is leaving your countries or is passing through, and you're not able to control that. Shows what kind of situation that these states are in, that either people want to leave. And remind you, these are people's homes. People don't just pack up and leave their homes at the drop of a hat. It's got to be pretty bad. So number one, it's bad. Number two is that, no one can stop them. It literally takes the United States border before anyone even slows them down. So that, in a nutshell, is at least where I'm at in the regards that if the United States wants to have a firm presence here, whether it be police and military, you can do that. And you can help shore up some gaps that need to be filled. that is, I'm not going to say open occupation, but it might be open military assistance, which usually hasn't gone over very well in this region. So they're probably not going to jump over on that one. But it could be the conversation that changes the game in some regards. The other side of that is we've tried with the policing part to some degree already, which is what Cypher was talking about. And that is most of our operatives that we send in, they believe in the mission, they go down. And the general consensus from anyone that I've talked to or have heard from is that we believe in it, but they don't. Almost everybody who is in a government position, whether it's police, law enforcement, or just the judiciary, is on the take. And it's one thing where you've got a few bad eggs. We always talk about policing here in America and how we've always got, a problematic judge or a sheriff. But when everybody's on the take, or at least like 80, 90% of people are on the take, you're not talking about fixing a system that has a few problems. You're talking about a complete structural overhaul, if not a complete rebuild. And that, like, again, I don't like to sound like a revolutionary, but when you're talking about the United States, most of our systems work pretty well. They need changes. They need tweaks and fixes. When you're talking about a lot of these Mexican systems or Central American systems, they almost need a full breakdown and rebuild. And that's just how bad it is that some systems do get to the point where they need systematic overhaul. And that's what we're looking at in Central America overall, is that the problem is that, for me, who controls these? It's the people who have power. It's the people who have influence. And that's fine. But whenever they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and it doesn't help anybody except themselves, well, that usually comes at fire and blood and brimstone. And that's why I'm just incredibly grim and dark on the solutions category, is that usually when we just see this kind of thing, it doesn't go over well in history. And if North has got some examples to like show me that I'm wrong, I'd love to see it. But most of the time, when you have extreme inequalities like this, when you have extreme power vacuums like this, you get French Revolution events, not, populist uprising.
Right.
Yeah, I can't think of any times when a military solution in a situation like this led to kind of a permanent thing. Like the only thing I can even remotely think of would have been rebuilding Germany post World War II, but that's a totally different scenario.
It is.
Yeah.
We can't have a Marshall Plan for Latin America.
I mean, like the U.S. would be highly suspicious of that.
Sure.
Latin America would be suspicious of us doing that, but I think they kind of do need something like a Marshall Plan, but like, where's it going to come from?
Right.
And be accepted is the question.
So here's the reality that, at least that I kind of been like drilling around and circling around of, is that like the reason why the Marshall Plan works so well for Europe is that, our former allies, such as the British and the French, have institutions that are very akin to ours. And then our former Axis that we basically defeated, we broke them. Like Germany is not a functional state in 1946, right? So we rebuilt their institutions, and that's one of the big reasons the Marshall Plan, is a massive success. 1955 is that Germany's back on its feet, but it's not the military aristocracy of the Junkers that is in control of Germany, or at least Western Germany. It is a democratic federal republic of Germany under, was it Kolm? I can't remember his name. But it's built in our image. Can we do the same thing for Mexico? Technically, yes. But it requires an outright invasion and the breaking of Mexican society to do that. Can you make a Marshall Plan afterward? Yeah. But you got to do it the right way. You have to literally, like, full-on annexation a country or a full-on conquer a country. We haven't done that since 1945.
And we're not going to. I don't think so. But
we've tried. I'm sorry. We tried to do it with Iraq, but we did it in like the most asinine way possible. But we also didn't look at the massive cultural, religious differences, which we talked about in a few episodes back. Is that, look, we tried to do kind of a Marshall Plan too with Iraq, but we also didn't understand that we're dealing with people that are not part of a more European heritage. We're dealing with people that live in the Islamic Aqidah system, right? Mm-hmm. That is semi-feudal to its own degree. We didn't go in and separate the balances of power and rewrite it in our image. We just basically gave people the framework, but we didn't actually pick winners and losers. And that's the
Right.
big thing that you have to do. You have to pick winners and losers. And that is unfortunately what the West has gotten really terrible with overall when it comes to far more heavy-handed approaches, is that we're not willing to do that. And that means getting your hands dirty.
Yeah.
So.
I agree with that. North Countryman, before we end, you were going to say something before I brought up my Marshall Plan comment. Do you want to expand upon that, or do you remember?
I mean, it wasn't
important.
It was a remark about Tiberius becoming a revolutionary Marxist. I'm like, let's get him a beret and have him look like Che Guevara.
Let's do it.
He's got
Read
the
the Red
beard
Book.
already, so I've got a copy somewhere. So
I'm sure we
former
all
professor, I have a shit ton of books in here.
I'm sure we all have bugs, but no, like there's a level where I think everybody's right. Like I've literally got positions across the entire political spectrum, from like lib right, auth right, all that stuff. I can literally go around the circle, and this is actually where like the left tends to have a point, is that if you don't have enough people who are middle class, who are maintaining the status quo of what we would call a normal industrialized society, all hell tends to break loose. And we've not seen the advancement of labor rights. We've not seen the advancement of workers' rights, and we've not seen the advancement of quote unquote human rights in a lot of Latin America that would really preeminate a higher standard of living and a higher level of prosperity for these states. And that's a huge problem.
That's a very good point, and I think that's a good point to end on. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our 5th episode of Narcostate. If this is the first time you've joined us, hey, welcome. I'm Cypher. I host the Crowdsourced Politics podcast, and we try to do Cypher State once a month. We do Crowdsourced Politics once a week, every Thursday. So please join us, hit that follow button and everything else. In fact, you know what? Hey, hit the like button, helps us out. And wait for it. And follow me on Twitter at Crowdsourced Poll. So go ahead, Tiberius, shout yourself out. Then the North Countryman, you shout yourself out, and then we'll wrap it up. Right.
All right, yeah. So I'm Tiberius D. I hope you all enjoyed this particular episode and what I had to say. I know I got really dark into that last section, but there is times where I openly get nihilist, and I'm not going to just hide my opinions like, oh, well, we can't do nothing. There's always an option. Just doesn't mean that it's the option that you can stomach or you like. But I will throw you the option. Anyway, so yeah, if you had any thoughts on my history topics, my geopolitical topics, or just anything else that I had to speak about today, I am on Twitch and YouTube. You can find me at twitch.tv/TiberiusD. That's with a Y, not an I. You can see that on your screen there. And then nice little display there with our names on it. So yeah, just come check out all the things that I do. Anything that you'd miss on Twitch, you can definitely find on YouTube. So YouTube's the better pick. Help me get to 1,000 followers so that I can not only monetize that, but I can have more of an emphasis on giving you produced content instead of live stream content. Because produced content, higher quality, but takes more time.
For sure. That's why I started live streaming myself. North Countryman, please shout yourself out.
I am at twitch.tv/North Countryman, and if you look at both mine and Tiberius's channels, you see the very clear difference between, someone's step 50 and someone's step 5. And it's honestly a very important thing to remember, just with anything in general. Like you're on your own progress bar, different from others. So I do my own stuff. I'm very recently getting into a consistent schedule that I can actually maintain. I'm usually late at night. And it's actual politics stuff, no drama, no nonsense, which I don't think Tiberius does that either, and I don't think you do it either, Cypher. Like, we're some of the few actual politics people in this space. There are a couple others, but we'll resist that big wave of drama and attention that everyone else focuses on, but. We got principles. Yeah, twitch.tv/North Countryman. It's a work in progress. Also, I think, Cypher, I think you called this the 5th episode of Narcostate in your outro.
Oh, did I? My bad.
Yep.
5th episode of Cypher State. My bad. Hey, we like jokes here, right? But yeah, everybody, go follow North Countryman. Go follow Tiberius D. They both produce really good content. Tiberius D will be live tonight, right?
Yep.
8 p.m.
Your time.
Central, so 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And hopefully I'll be there. So go ahead and check out Tiberius's D channel tonight for live Mask Off podcast greatness. And go ahead.
Sorry. I'll promo that real quick because I never do that enough. I'm just terrible at shutting myself out. If you guys are interested, the big live show that we do that is very popular is the Mascot Podcast. I've got a wonderful crew there. And Cypher is a pretty routine and regular guest on that show. And largely what that is, we just get together, a few friends and a few colleagues get together, and we talk about, it's more of a meme show in the regards that we talk about what's going on in our lives, we talk about what's going on in politics, and sometimes we just talk about like the interpersonal drama about what we do. But if any of that sounds hilarious, or if you want to see Cypher just sometimes a little bit tipsy, you can definitely check him out on the Mascot Podcast.
That is very true. I do like to have a little bit of a drinky drink every now and then. But yes, definitely check that out tonight. It's a good time. Basically, what he said. But everybody, with that, I am sad to say that we are actually out of time. I know you liked what you heard because you stayed with us now. So like I said, smash that like button for the algorithms. It really does help us out. Stick around for a little bit. I'm going to try to find people that we can raid. So if you know what that is, stick around. But as we always say at Crowdsourced Politics, keep your head up through the political storm. Right. All right, we should be good.
Should have been fixing to end